Let's talk cosmology. Cosmology refers to the way that the cosmos have been constructed. And when we talk about a scientific cosmology, we often think about like we've got the globe that is the Earth and it goes around the sun. And then we think about solar systems and just the vast expanse of space with all the stars and everything else. And that is the basic sort of cosmology that we've all learned growing up, especially if you went to public school and things like that, that this is how the world has been constructed. Well, it might surprise you to know that a biblical cosmology, a cosmology that comes from the ancient world, is depicted a little bit different than what we understand. And in fact, I think one of the clearest places that we see a biblical cosmology laid out is in the Christ hymn in Philippians 2. So if you go to Philippians 2, and we're learning about how after Jesus' humiliation, he was exalted to the right hand of the Father. And there we read, God has highly exalted him and bestowed on him the name that is above every other name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee should bow. Here it is. This is the cosmology. In heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. You'll remember that in the Great Commission, Jesus said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That's also what we call a merism, a marrying of the ends, in order to say Jesus has all authority everywhere. And perhaps the reason that he doesn't mention the under the earth there is because there already is no authority under the earth. But here is a way of saying, look, everywhere and everything that exists in the Christ hymn, which Paul is probably quoting here, the Apostle Paul, he's probably quoting something that existed in the early church. Perhaps he wrote it himself. I'm not sure. I'm not sure we can be sure. But he chooses to describe cosmology as all-encompassing. Everything that exists is tied up in heaven, earth, and under the earth. So I've got my cheat sheet here just so I can remember to talk about everything. I want to first just kind of briefly describe an Old Testament cosmology. If we're going back to perhaps not the garden, I'm going to talk about the garden in a minute, but back to the cosmology of like the days of Israel. And basically, the way that the ancient person thought is that when they died, they went down to the grave. So they have heaven above, and heaven above is kind of the abode of the gods or the abode of the divine. And heaven represents sort of the spirit world and the goodness of the creator. And so they look up to the heavens and they believe that God is in heaven or in the heavens, and they see the sun and the moon and the stars and these. And I don't think that they necessarily thought that that like dot of light up there was a god per se or anything like that. But the ancient person is thinking about these as representing divine beings, perhaps in some cultures and at some times, perhaps even in Israel, they're thinking about them as actual divine beings sitting up there watching over them. And sometimes it's like the souls of our ancestors are up there in some cultures. That wouldn't be the case for the Israelites. The Israelites had this concept of Sheol, and to death meant to go down into the grave. Now, I want to create a clarification here that not everybody always thinks about. A lot of times they go, okay, heaven, the abode of the divine, earth, the abode of man. And actually, that's not true. That there is something in the creation of man. Man is actually created between heaven and earth. And I think that's an important theological point to make, that humans are created reaching towards heaven, and yet with this understanding that in death we go down to the earth, we go down into the grave, into Sheol, or by the time we get to the Greek world, now we're calling it Hades. And just sort of not to borrow the whole theology of Hades from the Greeks, but just to use the word that largely coincides with this idea of grave. So in death, one that might look to heaven and hope for interaction with the divine in life knows that in death they will go down into the grave. And yet, not everybody thought about the grave as like an eternal resting place. But in the Israelite mindset, consider David. And this shows up in some of the prophets too, but David in Psalm 16 says, I know that you will not abandon my soul to Sheol. And so you kind of get this idea that he knows that even though he goes to the grave, that he's not sort of stuck there forever. And I think that's just a really important observation to make, that even though in Old Testament cosmology, doesn't immediately hope for heaven. There's sort of an anticipation that the grave is not the end. Now, the grave, this isn't just heaven and earth. Perhaps that's how many people were, what they were concerned about. But there is also in Old Testament cosmology a great deep. There is the depths. And I think of like Jonah 2, and you can go watch my video on Jonah if you want to see kind of how that works when Jonah is swallowed by the great fish. But there is an under the earth, like an abode where the disobedient sons of God, the angels essentially who sinned in Genesis 6, where they are chained in the great deep because of their disobedience. They're chained in gloomy darkness is the language of the New Testament. Peter and Jude both reference this event. So you have heaven, earth, and under the earth, and humans know that in death they go into the earth. They leave their position between heaven and earth, and they enter into death, into the earth, where there is some kind of hope of a ascent to heaven, to the divine. Now let's talk New Testament cosmology here. New Testament does actually hope in heaven, and I have a sermon posted on my website on Psalm 22, because something really important happens when Jesus rises from the dead. When Jesus rises from the dead, you have the event that we call the harrowing of hell, or it's really not the right thing to call it though. It's really the harrowing of Hades, or the harrowing of Sheol, or the harrowing of the grave. Because what happens between the Old and the New Testament is when Jesus rises and you have sort of in the grave, everybody's there, but it's thought of in the Israelite mindset. You can see this in the Jesus parable of Lazarus, where he's thinking of the lame man on the good side with Abraham, and then the rich man over on the bad side where it's, burning and he's thirsty and all of that. And so there's sort of two sides of the grave, two sides of Sheol. But now when Jesus rises, he cracks open the grave so that he can bring the saints with him and rescue them up into heaven as he ascends to the right hand of the Father, so they ascend with him. And you can see that in Matthew. I'm not going to get into every verse about this. Google can help you with that if you need to find it. But New Testament cosmology now, because the grave has been opened, now we have access to heaven. And so you have life that we receive. That is, as we believe in the Son, John 3:16, we will not perish, go down to the grave, but have everlasting life. We rise with him. The Apostle Paul hoped that, he hoped in this. He said that he wishes to be absent from the body so that he can be present with the Lord, right? That sort of thinking. And so in a New Testament cosmology, we have heaven life, or death, earth below. And it's really interesting because then you just think about yourself as a living, breathing human being. And this means that you're caught up in this tension between life and death. And so all of your human life right now, becomes for lack of a better word, it becomes like an experiment in pursuing heaven, pursuing life through Christ, or in your rejection of Christ, pursuing death in the earth, in the grave. And so that's New Testament cosmology. And then, of course, we have, still the under the earth, because, if you look at Enoch, for example, and I've written about this in my book, The Watchers and the Holy Ones, there is still, even in the Old Testament mindset, but definitely in the New Testament mindset, a time when those disobedient angels are released so that they can be thrown into the lake of fire. And we'll get to that in our study of Revelation at some point as well. But yeah, so here you've got life up, death in the earth below, and then this place of gloomy darkness even below that. And that's New Testament basic cosmology. One last note on that before we move on to talking about garden cosmology is that sort of Hades, or Sheol, becomes hell, or Gehenna. And this is something that people miss. People think hell is the lake of fire. It's the eternal thing. And I understand why they're mixing the fire imagery. But I would just note that even in the Sheol imagery, in the Abraham's bosom imagery, those who are on the dark side, they still have that fire imagery. So those who die without Christ, we're still supposed to think about them in some kind of fiery torment, even now. And so you don't have to wait for the lake of fire at the end to have the fire imagery. And so I think that Gehenna, hell, is sort of what's left of the grave. That the only people who now descend are the people who descend to the fiery side, And that's what we call hell or Gehenna. Eventually, death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire. Okay? So if Hades, Sheol, death is not a thing anymore already in New Testament cosmology, then it doesn't really make a lot of sense that it's thrown into the lake of fire. What that's saying in the end, when death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire, it's saying hell. What's left of Hades, the hell side, is thrown into the lake of fire. So I hope that makes sense. You can kind of see it here on the cosmology chart. The next one I want to talk about is garden cosmology. And so I want to go back to Adam and Eve and the garden. And I want to talk about like sort of like the design. And so you have heaven above and you have earth below, but they're not well defined because in Ezekiel, for example, but I mean, I think the imagery is all in all kinds of places. The garden is depicted as in one sense, it's depicted as a temple. It's a place where you ascend the tiers of the temple into the most holy place, which is probably, I think we should think where the tree of life is, right? In the most holy place at the highest point of the mountain. And so you have the earth is depicted as this mountain that reaches up towards God. And so this is why temples are built in tiers, where the higher you go in the temple and the further in you go in the temple, the closer you get to God. It's C.S. Lewis. It's the Narnia series. It's further up and further in is the closer you get to God. And so the earth is a temple. But then we should also think of mountains as places where heaven reaches down. And this is why sort of in Enoch, again, just think about the Watchers, the Watchers come down on a mountain, right? And so they come down at a mountain because mountains are sort of a soft spot between heaven and earth, where heaven and earth meet and where you can commune with the divine on the mountaintop. And this is just ancient cosmology. It's the way that people think. And so think about it that way, right? So that Adam and Eve in the garden had this perfect communion with God where, because you get in Genesis 3 that they walk in the cool of the day with the Lord, right? And so you get this there, that they have this communion, this meeting with God in the garden. And then that's what's broken. We should think about when sin enters the world in Genesis 3 and they're told to leave the garden. We should be thinking about them sort of descending the mountain. Remember, they inherit death as part of I don't like to call it the curse, but as part of their rebellion, they've received death. What we call the curse is receiving the logical conclusion of their behavior. So they're leaving now the presence of God. They're descending the mountain, and they descend down into the wilderness. When we think of wilderness, we think of these flatlands, the desert just with nothing in it, right? So they're coming down off of the mountain and they're going out into the desert. And so you'll notice on the cosmology chart, though, that it's heaven and earth, and there is no abyss at this point, that there is no great deep. There is no place where at the pillars of the earth that we have disobedient angels chained in gloomy darkness or anything like that, because that hasn't entered into the narrative yet. And so garden cosmology really is just about heaven, earth, and the life that we have in God, in Christ, in the garden, or the life that Adam and Eve had in God, in Christ, in the garden. Okay, but then they descend, then we go back, we have Old Testament cosmology, Jesus rises from the dead, we have New Testament cosmology, and this is why I put these together, I want you to now think about kingdom cosmology. I want you to think about the consummation of the kingdom in Jesus' return. And so now in Jesus' return, we have the same thing as in the garden, where we think of the New Jerusalem come down upon the earth. And it's the mountain of God returned, except now the garden is a worldwide garden. It's the city of God that, the dominion mandate given to Adam and Eve. They were supposed to build the city of God upon all of the earth. And so that's what comes down now, that all chaos has been conquered. The first Adam didn't accomplish that, but the second Adam not only redeemed what was broken in the first Adam, but now he returns with the kingdom. And comes down onto the earth now, the New Jerusalem, and that spreads to the extents of the globe. So that, well, I shouldn't say the globe because they're not thinking globe in biblical cosmology, but it extends to the ends of the land, the ends of the earth. And this again is a place where heaven and earth meet. Sometimes people think of I've even heard people argue for this, sort of people in the dispensational crowds. They argue that heaven is where Christians go, like some kind of spiritual float around with harps heaven, and that the new Jerusalem on the earth is just for the Jewish people. And if you know what dispensational theology is about, like it's about creating separation between the Old and the New Testament. And so the people of Israel are so distinct in this way of thinking. It's an extreme dispensational thinking. They're so distinct that they actually have a different inheritance. And I would actually say that this extreme dispensationalism is heresy because it's creating a second gospel. The Jews are saved by being Jews, and they receive this eternal inheritance, right? But we are saved through Christ, and we receive this other inheritance. So it's creating two rewards, and it's creating two means of gaining that reward, which means that there's two gospels, and that's why I say it's technically heresy. I'm not saying all dispensationalists are heresy. I'm saying if you take it to that great extent, then you've got a problem. There's not two gospels. But anyway, so that's what happens, is that we start to think about them separate sometimes, but it's really not. It's when the new heaven and the new earth, happen in Revelation 21 and 22, we should think back to Genesis 1, when in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, right? That's what we should think about, is that everything that was destroyed by sins, the cosmos, that all of our thinking about cosmology between the garden and the consummation of the kingdom in the end, all of that cosmology has been tainted by sin. And so that's why we need this state of death in the earth. And it's why we need this place to chain the disobedient angels in gloomy darkness. You understand? So like that's the idea. But now in kingdom eschatology, and you'll have to toy with what to do with this, because you have this sense of purification that happens. So I've got this arrow pointing off to the side where now those who have all of those, whether it's the devil and his angels, or it's the reprobate, those who took the mark of the beast instead of taking the mark of Christ. We're going to talk about that whenever we get to that, going through Revelation. But whoever's taken the mark of the beast is now thrown into the lake of fire. And so you do have to wrestle with if this is a return to the garden. And just note that the garden cosmology doesn't have a lake of fire. It doesn't have a great deep. It doesn't have an abyss or a pit where we have disobedient angels and where we have disobedient humans, because in the very beginning, that wasn't part of the design. It wasn't part of the plan. So what does it mean to return to that? Does this lake of fire then mean a purging and a return to the garden cosmology? Or does the lake of fire sort of become a place of eternal torment where they now continue to exist in some kind of abstract state of death? Okay, so just something to think about, something to tease out. I'm going to pin a video about that at the end of the video, so just something to think about there. But yeah, so this is cosmology, and I just think it's important for a couple of reasons. So real quick, as we think about cosmology, I think it's important to, when you get to certain passages, Philippians 2 is one of these passages, that you go heaven, earth, and under the earth, right? That should create in your mind a sense of Christ's authority over all things. And so then you think about, who has the keys to hell, or who has the keys to Tartarus, who has the keys to those shackles that the angels are chained in gloomy darkness. And it's like, oh, well, Jesus has them, right? And then it starts to make sense of things, because then you get to, for example, the book of Revelation, and an angel comes down and he's got the keys, and it makes you go, well, where'd he get these keys from, right? Doesn't the devil rule in hell? And it's like, no, actually, everything comes over this grand purview of God's sovereignty, right? And this isn't it's funny because we don't think about cosmology this way too much as sort of Western Americans, but it's not super, super old. Like if you go to Dante, which I think is like 12th century, he's thinking about this way. And you can search for Dante cosmology charts, and you can see, I didn't bring my Dante book or I would show it to you, but you can see in the cosmology charts that even for Dante, there is a sense in which God is around all things, that all things exist within God, even in the earth, the grave, and even under the earth. And so it makes you start to go, well, if God is the God of life, and what is he doing in redeeming and purifying the world, right? And so it makes us think about how all of these different images fit together a little bit better so that you don't fall prey to sort of that Gnostic thinking of like good God, bad God, or you could think Marcionite thinking, not more than Gnosticism, but like good God, bad God sort of thinking. And the devil thinks he's going to win. And then we as Christians go, oh, but we've read the end of the story. We know the devil doesn't win. But actually, the narrative of Scripture is pretty interesting there because not only doesn't the devil win, but where did the devil get whatever kind of authority he has through at different points in the biblical narrative? Well, he got it from God. God is so powerful that he can take this devil, this Satan, this rebellious divine being, and he can take and use him for his good purposes. You know, Romans 8:28. He uses all for the good of those who love him, to those who are called according to his purpose, right? That he even uses the devil in his like extreme rebellion, the devil who's trying to dethrone God himself, that he uses him within this grand scheme of cosmology. That's how big God is. That's how sovereign God is. Sovereign is a kingship word, right? And so that's all I think I need to say about cosmology. If you have questions about cosmology, there's lots of little details to fill in throughout all of these maps. This is by all not even remotely everything to say about cosmology. This is just the basic framework. So, you know, go ahead and throw those in the comments. Love to answer those and engage with you there. God bless. Remember, Christ is king, and that changes everything.